Hello, it's Laurie or BlockchainBrad, and today I'm very honoured to speak with Holochain. We have two representatives from the team, both Aussies, and both here to really let us know what they've been doing and what they plan to do in this very robust ecosystem that we all know as Holochain. Guys, thank you very much for your time. We have David, and we also have Philip here. David Atkinson, more specifically, is the commercial director, and Philip Beadle is a key developer in the Holochain ecosystem. So once again, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
No worries.
So guys, it's great to hear the Aussie accent. Great that you are here. But for those who are wondering, this is entirely free for all people. And most importantly, the premise here or the agenda is to provide introduction, a key to the key aspects and fundamentals of Holochain. Hopefully later we'll break it down into key aspects, but right now it's digging deep into the basics and what these guys are doing, what they plan to do. So let's start, gentlemen, with essentially the problem. I want to talk about that before we go into the depths of what Holochain are actually doing, because for you to mean something, there must have been a reason why you started. What encouraged you to build this ecosystem out, especially given that you entered into this space when cryptocurrencies, for example, and crypto assets already existed? There must have been something that really prompted you to really build this out.
I'll let you take it first.
All right. Well, yeah, one of the big things is that Holochain doesn't have a currency. So there's a distinction between Holochain, which is the platform we've built, which is free and open source, and people can use that for whatever they like, and Holo, which is our distributed hosting company. So we actually have hardware, and there's 3,000 of them now all around the world. I've got one running just behind me here. Mm-hmm. And that's to provide distributed hosting. So you don't have to then pay companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Google to host your websites. You can be paying your friends to look after your website as well. Mm-hmm. That's the part that has the currency.
So Phil, given that there's a whole ecosystem or a whole framework, that's Holochain itself, and you're suggesting that the currency that we tend to see that drives startups in the past in crypto is very different to Holochain's model. But can you talk to us a bit more about the problem, though? The problem preceding Holochain as an ecosystem, regardless of the different components. What were some of the things that perhaps some of the other startups were doing that you felt needed to be improved or tweaked or quite simply changed so that there was a better solution from more the people's standpoint? When you talk about agent-centrism as a key component, clearly that's a solution to a problem. So what's the issues that you see in the space?
Oh, as you're aware, one of the big problems with the blockchain projects is scalability, like the number of transactions that they can get through these. And I've seen there's various projects around claiming much faster rates than we're getting. But for me, I've been a programmer for 30 years, and the concept of trying to build something on like Ethereum and those sorts of things, it just seemed a bit ridiculous. Like this idea that everything that everybody ever does anywhere, anytime is now all in one big blockchain. And if you look at the size of it now, it's gigabytes. So there's no way for you and I to run a node of Ethereum on any sort of normal hardware, let alone a phone, right? Whereas with Holochain, because Holochain is a series of different networks for every different application that you're using, even down to, say, like if you think of like Facebook, that would be one app, but inside there you've got groups and things. So we can actually split that into multiple different networks depending on who's in that particular group.
Right, and that's an interesting analogy too, because for a long time we've been looking at blockchain and crypto in a very linear fashion, and certainly even Vitalik recently tweeted out suggesting that soon Ethereum is going to be full. Now we can extrapolate that in another time and understand what he actually was implying there, but the difference you're making is that with Holochain, it's almost like the family tree. This infinite potential to assert more of the network throughout its ecosystem.
Yeah, and the network is designed around activity and use. So so when you look at sharding solutions and the nature, like people are applying mathematical abstractions without relating to human or agent-based activity. And actually, so Brad, going back to your question, just a few other things. So there's Phil, myself, there's Art and Eric Harris-Baron, who are founders of Holochain. There's a bunch of people who've been in the community, like Matt Schutte, etc., in this ecosystem for a period of time. I'd say there's a couple of moments I think are worth sharing. Mm-hmm. So I think like Art and Eric especially met and bonded over better currency designs, and especially how the technology of today, married with a deep understanding of flows of value or an ability to see value, can change the way we live and work, collaborate. Mm-hmm. And so the thinking about these kind of currencies 10 years ago, and so there's been across the sort of the close Holochain ecosystem, so people, supporters, followers, who've been actively thinking about this for the last decade, there was an idea of building a variable supply currency, because the perception within the Holochain ecosystem is that fixed supply, by its design, incentivizes early adopters disproportionately and doesn't create the kind of productive economies that we want to live in. So that's one massive driver.
And then, Dave, I want to talk to you on that though. I hope that's okay, and just hold the thought of the others.
Well, we could be going for 100 hours.
Well, I just want to talk about that briefly with the fact that at the time, you mentioned a decade ago, and at that time, BTC was king, and many would argue it still is, and depending on how you sort of color and view Bitcoin now. But was it also something that the team really acknowledged then when they were doing their assessment of value, when they were doing their planning for their own solution and exploring possibilities, utilizing the technology that was offered through cryptography, most importantly through blockchain? Was the team inspired by some of the challenges that Bitcoin literally was showing to the team at the time?
My feeling on how we work is that, again, Holochain, whether it's just in the name or inherently in our approach to solving problems, is holographic. So fractals become a hugely important part of what we're doing and how we work. So Holochain came out of Scepter, which is... I'll let Phil explain technically Scepter if it comes up, or they'll definitely be in a follow-up interview. But the reason I reference it is Holochain is designed from designing the future and looking back. So Scepter might be how we see the future in 25 years' time. Holochain is looking back 15 years, so 10 years into our current future, and then Holo bridges and says, well, how do you make that work for today? Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's a very effective design pattern, because it's much easier to imagine something bigger or greater and design the smaller set. And so it wasn't so much, yes, there's some challenges with Bitcoin, etc., but that isn't the fundamental driving. That's not the fundamental driver. What we're trying to look at is how can computing be done better.
Right, exactly. Now, gentlemen, you talk about, though, the finite supply. So that's why I was alluding to some of those questions as well there, Dave. But in doing something that almost flipped literally that philosophy and that tokenomic design on its head, now you're suggesting through your modeling that perhaps, looking at more infinite approaches to supply is a better solution. Can you talk us through why that is the case?
Yeah, well, let's explain what it actually means first. So if you think about Bitcoin, it's like, you have to mine for a coin, and then the value of that coin goes up and down depending on how many people want it. So if lots of people want it, it becomes more scarce and the price goes up. When nobody cares about it anymore, the price drops.
Right.
Which means that if I go and buy a coffee with it, today it's $3 for the coffee, tomorrow it's $40, the day after it's 5 cents. It's not something that you can use to buy normal day-to-day things.
So not stable, not something that we can be sure of a maintenance of its value. And most importantly in that sense is that it rests on the position of belief or the power of belief. That's
right. Whereas the currency that we've designed to drive the hosting network is called Holofuel, and that's what's called a mutual credit currency. And think of it like, let's say, let's do an Australian analogy. We'll go out for beers on Friday, right? And I buy the beers. So this Friday, I'm 10 beers in credit because you owe me 10 beers because we're Australian, we're going 10.
Nice
then
one.
next week we go out. I don't need to pay because
But I don't
it's your turn. But you don't come.
So who pays?
But the overall value of the number of beers in that network is at any one time 0.
Right.
At all times, right?
Because it's a credit, a mutual credit.
That's right. Exactly. So then the next week, Dave comes out with us again, and we need more credit in the system because we're going to drink more beer. So the number of potential beers goes up because I'm willing to front that credit for the week, knowing that the next week it's going to come back at some point. And that's the same with the hosting network. So I've got my Holo port in my office here, and I'm willing to front you $30 a month to look after your website, knowing that at the end of the month you'll pay for that. So I effectively put $30 worth of credit into the Holofuel system, and I have effectively printed money.
I see. So essentially, the value of trust in the overarching system of Holochain is, what drives Holofuel, for example, and what makes it possible.
That's right. So what happens is as more and more people join the network and start to extend credit to more and more customers, the amount of credit in the system goes up, even though the actual net value is still always 0.
Yeah,
which means that as the demand goes up, like everybody wants to host their websites on Holo now, which means that lots more people will come into the system and extend that and provide that service and extend that credit. So there is all that value in the system. And then, but what happens is that the actual per credit value is extremely stable.
Yeah. I think that's the key difference, that stability in the mutual credit is what I think is attracting a lot of attention right now for developers, for those who are trying to look for an alternative tokenomic model or a token modeling solution, more open systems when it comes to not just open source, but also open points of value. So are you talking about stable? It also reflects what we've seen in the past when it comes to currencies that have been successful, but you want to do this in a decentralized, people-centric, agent-centric way.
Yeah, and it's not actually decentralized, it's actually distributed.
Oh, my apologies, yes. And we can talk about the distinction between that. Right. Now, I interrupted you before, Dave.
Because the simplest way, I think, for I know, because you're teaching people, to me, the simplest way of describing the currency design pattern is that in a fixed supply world, you have your supply, you're doing your best to constrain your circulating supply as possible, so you need the smallest amount of demand to affect price. Okay? But price is the factor that settles the supply-demand equation.
Yes.
Whereas when you're talking about Holofuel, it's very easy to use the analogy of a sharing economy application. If I have a car, I have an Uber equivalent, and I have my supply on the road, and demand increases. Yep, supply fluctuates a little bit price fluctuates a little bit, and that price change incentivizes new supply, or could incentivize less supply. So then supply settles the demand equation, not price. And that's a really crucial part of a productive economy, because in a productive economy, you want supply and demand to be as close together as possible. And so, you don't want price to be the thing that settles that equation.
It's a very interesting, and obviously we're in a very price-driven sort of ecosystem right now in present day when it comes to crypto, and you want to change that narrative, obviously. Now, when it comes to comparisons to gold, for example, gentlemen, obviously it being a relatively finite resource, people argue, how that can be accurate. But let's just say that for the most part, there's a finite amount of that, whether we discovered all of it or not, aside from a meteor hitting Earth. But so in terms of having a fixed supply, something that has properties, is a real physical element. Why do people focus so much on this as a comparison when they talk about assets or digital assets, for example? And why do people focus so much on finite supplies when indeed perhaps the narrative should really shift to what Holochain is trying to propose?
I just think it's, well, firstly, because we're in such an abstract world, the concept of decentralized money outside the bubble of people who really get it, both from a technical perspective, but also get it from a deep understanding of the banking system, that's a small world. And creating knowledge transfer from that world to the mainstream is pretty difficult.
Yes.
Especially. See, exactly. So this idea that you can say, look, we've got this kind of money, it's like gold, people can kind of get it. And I think for us, in the audience who's out here listening, maybe this is an interesting problem, but I don't think the problem really matters that much for us, in that if we can build distributed, productive economies, and people can experience them as vastly superior to the centralized economies that they're working with, whether it's one application, another application. I'm participating in this Holochain Twitter. Wow, this is great because, this is how my personas shift within the Twitter. This is how I'm involved in the governance of the application. This is the infrastructure cost for running this kind of things. Whatever the tipping point's going to be for these Holochain applications, what we'll be able to do is have more effective currency patterns that incentivize adoption and use of applications. So I think the philosophical argument doesn't matter so much as in right incentives to be able to build great scalable applications.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. I mean, we don't have enough of this kind of transparent response, to be honest with you, Dave, because right now most are trying to advocate for price, advocate for pushing the value of their current startup. So what you're essentially saying is that tech coupled with use case, coupled with developers, really building the ecosystem, that's what really matters. And that essentially the ecosystem will determine its value according to the ecosystem growth, not on the price of a currency. Because firstly, you're not price centric. You're more about trying to be a stable representation for developers to start to take this really seriously and really start to build this out. So that's what I want to focus on now for a moment. Talk us through the developer side of this. Talk us through the technological underpinnings that really make it attractive for a developer to really start to build on Holochain. And how's the success going in this very ambitious startup?
Mm-hmm. One of the things as a developer for a long time, I've always been a bit worried about the centralization of data. Like Facebook, they've got 2 billion users now and they own all that data because you literally sign your life away. And one of the things I really wanted to get was, I had this fantasy of like, when I write something into my, my Facebook clone, I want that data to be on my machine. And if I'm talking to you, Brad, I want it to be shared to you, and that's it. And this was 5 or 6 years ago. I thought about this idea, and then I came across Holochain, and that's exactly how it works. You literally, there's a chat app that I've just been building, and one of the other big things is that we talked about agent-centric data before. Mm-hmm. If you think about how many websites you've logged into, and how many times you've typed in your first name, last name, address, all those kinds of details, for me, it's thousands of websites now over my career. And that data is everywhere. And I've got no idea where it is. It's never updated. I don't know what they're doing with it. And then along came the convenience factor, that log in with Facebook. Oh yeah, I'll do that because I can't be bothered filling out my form again.
Right. And we didn't bother reading all the fine print either.
Exactly. And it doesn't matter if you do, because they change it all the time.
Right.
Sometimes as it come up on your phone, click here because we've changed the terms and conditions. Right? So what happens now is that everybody clicks log in with Facebook or log in with Google or even log in with GitHub, all these kinds of things. And what those companies now do is not only do they have your personal data, but they track everything that you do on the internet, every website you go to. Because if you log in on one site and then open another tab and start doing something on another website, they're tracking that as well, and it's insidious. And I wrote a blog post recently where I showed what happens with a PayPal transaction, and that's pretty frightening. So what we've done is we've given you back the ability to look after your own data, but with the same convenience factor.
And Phil, what's really interesting about this is a lot of people don't talk about how the real gold is actually the data itself. That's the real core asset in this new and emerging economy and technological wave. But I want to also talk about, we've seen things like the Great Hack really expose the inherent monetization that was happening with data. So in giving back the people access and autonomy, are you also inherently, by having this robust ecosystem, enabling them to monetize as well? Is there that aspect to it?
Yeah, well, if you think about what these companies like Facebook and Google are doing, what they collect all of this like ridiculous amounts of data, and then they develop algorithms to basically come up with the lowest common denominator so that they can figure out something to sell you that you don't really need.
Yeah, it's disgusting.
That's right. If you think, and nobody's really truthful on the internet, right? Everything you see is an edited version. Nobody actually says what they really want to do. They don't really talk to their friends using chat apps, being really truthful, because in the back of their mind, they know that, you know, Mark's reading it all, or one of his machines.
Yeah, it's the common Facebook effect. We want to present the best of ourselves, which is not necessarily who we really are.
So now think about those advertising algorithms, right? How likely are they to be able to actually give you something that you're really looking for, knowing that all of the data you've put onto the internet is not really true?
It's a really good point. I never actually thought about that. So essentially they're conditioning it to an ideal.
Exactly. Now think about it, switch around the other way. Let's say that this is how Holochain works. All of that data that I type in is only shared, like if we're having an online chat now, you, me and David, that data only goes to us three. So we can be a lot more truthful about what we're talking to each other about. And what I say is stored on my machine or in my devices, right?
Right. So what could that do socially, Phil, given that this is technology driven, literally from, you know, the code itself, but the implications for this for social reform, arguably redressing some of the inherent problems of these centralized parties. You know, we're talking about Facebook, that is a global phenomenon, but it's also in conversations around the world now, it's argued as a global problem. So could Holochain fundamentally redress some of the problems inherent with centralized power?
Well, that's part of the idea is to give, have you heard of the term unenclosable communication?
I have now.
Okay, so like David and I are sitting next to each other and we're talking. There's literally nothing you can do to stop us communicating. There's nothing you can do to corrupt my message, and for me to communicate directly with David. However, you're over the internet, right? I have no idea if that's actually you, or if somebody's intercepted that feed and is now pretending to be you and is now extracting data from me.
Right.
And you can go right back to like caveman, right? Once people got out of voice range, we developed this thing called writing so that we could communicate with people. Then as soon as we developed writing, that means that the person who has the written word now has control of it. And it's up to them whether or not they deliver it to you, or do they change it, or do they manipulate it, or do they charge you access to that data. That's enclosed. What we are aiming to do with Holochain is bring back unenclosable communication. Which
essentially is trust.
Yes. Because if you think about the way that like intentional communities work, you know, you usually get, you know, maybe 15 to 20 people get together, go, right, we're going to build a community. And if it's successful, it'll grow over time. Usually gets up to about 150, and then it'll start to collapse because of the people, like, what do they call it? The telephone game. You know, I give a message and it gets slowly corrupted as it gets further down the chain.
Yeah, Chinese whispers.
Yeah, but we don't call it that anymore.
Oh, well, I just did. Sorry about that.
But exactly that, yeah. So with Holochain, because you can test that message hasn't been corrupted, hasn't been modified, and you can test all the way back to its original source, what we expect to happen is we'll get coordination at scale. People will be able to trust that the messages that they're getting from the people in their community that they are listening to haven't been corrupted, haven't been changed, because you can test the hash chain And
this is really fascinating because, this is also going to arguably change the game when it comes to developers, onboarding, and then parties beyond that. So talk to us, gentlemen, about the value of this technology now in the real scenario of adoption authentically, because the reason why I want to just get so direct about it is because we see a lot of suggestions, we see a lot of hype, we hear a lot of prospecting, or see evidence of prospecting for developers and trying to assume value, but there's not a lot of proof that the developers and dApps actually happen. You have your own apps, as you mentioned. So how many do you have currently, and how is this starting to flourish?
Yeah, so when you build a Holochain app, or a HAP as we call it, most of the work is still in the front end, the UX, right? Because essentially Holochain and Holo are just a data integrity layer. You can think of it like that. It's essentially like programming for web services. It's very similar to using something like serverless or AWS services, that sort of thing. Most of the work comes from building a nice user experience for your customers. If you think about any social network, right, you have communities, posts, comments, and votes. Literally, they all work essentially the same thing, right? But the user experience of how you're doing that is different depending on which one you're using. And what we're advocating for in our ecosystem is that each of those sections, like let's say posts, right? A post is a post is a post. So it doesn't matter which social network you're using, you should be using the same code. And because you can do these different groups by people using a particular piece of code, and then they're on a particular group, and you can make both these. You can literally clone that same code into a new group, which is a new separate network with a different group of people on it. And then your front end, and typically I've been using React lately with GraphQL. You can then use the front end to connect up. How does all this work together? And one of the nice things about doing that is, let's say you're using one social network and I'm using a different one. We can communicate because the DNA is the same, or the code, which we call the DNA, for that particular functionality, which means that you're not then tied in to one particular company's way of giving you a user experience. Let's say you don't like using whatever it is that you're using now. Somebody else shows you a new one because it's a cooler way to do it, or whatever, or it works on a different device or whatever. You shouldn't be restricted in not using that because all of your friends are on something else.
Right, and Phil, that's where you come in, though. Given that you're one of the lead developers, and there's a lot of engineers in your team, but you're also alluding to the fact that you offer that sort of cross collaborative, or more so, you offer the protocol itself to be able to be integrated in a multitude of different scenarios, and an infinite amount of them. In fact, you also talk about how you're trying to build out independent and autonomous systems and ecosystems in your network of networks. But what I wanted to ask, though, is how do you get developers on board? How do you showcase that this is a seamless technology, and more importantly, that it's easy to integrate? Do you have a front end that's easy to access? Have you got a tool suite that's simple? I mean, what are you doing to really make sure that people get it when it comes to ease of adoption?
Okay, so for a developer, we use, like we got Windows, Linux, Mac, they're operating systems, right? There's one called Nix OS, and that is a declarative version of Linux. And it's also got some really neat tools. There's one called Nix Shell. And what we've done is we've set up a configuration file for that so that you can just literally use, you type Nix Shell and then holochain.love, and it will set up your environment with everything you need. You can literally just start developing for Holochain straight away.
And that's already now?
Yeah, that's exactly how we work right now. The beautiful thing about that is that you get as close to parity as possible with the Holo ports that we've shipped, because they are running Nix OS, what we call Holoport OS. So can I just lift mine up?
Oh, you want to lift it up? Yep.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I see that. Yeah. That's the Holoport. Yeah, I see that. I mean, the viewers may not. Oh, we can see the green light now.
Yeah. So that hardware runs exactly the same setup as we've got in the development environment. which is pretty rare to get as a developer. Normally you work on some sort of development environment and then hope that your build system can deploy it to wherever it goes. But
that's really interesting. So how's the feedback been for you, Phil, given that, you're part of the team trying to make this transition into, a whole lot of app developers trying to really utilize the systems you're literally building? Has the feedback been positive, and are you seeing influx yet in the uptake from the developer community?
Initially it was a bit more difficult because our language that we're using is Rust, which is basically like a safe C# version. Sorry, C#. There's my Microsoft bake days. C++, memory safe, and people think it is unforgiving, but that is because it is a compile time language. So when it's completely unforgiving because it won't let you make compiler errors, which for someone who's a JavaScript developer is like, whoa, how come I can't just do that? And it'll break, the only way I'll find out if it's broken is because the customer told me it's broken. What happens is that at compile time, every single error is shown to you. And it's really good in its feedback and telling you how to fix those problems. So that can be a little tricky, and it was more difficult to set up in the first time, making sure you had the right versions of Rust and all the other bits and pieces that went with it.
Okay.
But now that we have HoloNix, which is our version of Nix, and that's all set up for you, it's really, really straightforward. You literally
that's good. So basically, you're breaking down some of those barriers so that people can have that flexibility for different programming languages. That's important because one of the things we see with leading technologies is they give you a suite of options. Do you think in the future also, I would imagine, given that you've got Nix now, that you'll only improve this at means of access and the options that they have to essentially start to build the applications and the apps?
That's right. Yeah, we chose Rust because it compiles to WebAssembly, or wasn't.
Okay, right. And that's the big buzzword right now.
The big buzzword, yeah.
Just jump in because it's a really important thread. And at the same time, if you go back to really your why question, the original question, you go back to what we're building. You think, okay, so Holochain, framework for designing distributed applications, no currency, builds network of networks. Even I just say those words.
Yeah, say them again. Let's hear them again. That's nice and clean. Let's go again. Step by step.
Right. So here's my framework for building the distributed applications. What we're saying is, forget any of the platforms out there. This is a framework that you can use to build any distributed application you want. Right?
Including blockchain.
Including blockchains.
Good point to add there.
Yep. There's should be in that core infrastructure, there should be no currency. Because the moment you add a currency, the incentive is to suck the value into the platform or into the protocol. And at the same time, we have no idea. We've got some visions, but in terms of mass adoption and what the world will do with that, we have no idea. Because it really, through Holochain's perspective, when you get deep into agent-centricity, when you get deep into distributed computing, it's shifting the way the world can work. We already talked about the potential to do collaboration at scale with Holochain. So we had to build Holo, not just because you need a distributed hosting environment, but because you need to do something of some order of complexity to showcase the value of Holochain.
And it's almost the irony, because right now people want proof before perhaps it's ready for evidence of empirically that it can be done. It's particularly when it comes to those that have that, as you mentioned, that currency or digital asset, which is an anomalous term for just simply something that's tokenized and can be purchased on exchange. Now, basically, what you're suggesting is it's once again reinforcing the imperative that things have to be about a new conceptualization of technology coupled with use case and work from that.
What incentives are so crucial in this. And so I think we've talked about before this idea of, a fixed supply currency, you need belief. For value to increase in a fixed supply currency, belief is such a crucial part of the equation. Belief is important in any ecosystem. It just needs to be in the right place. So in our design, the belief in the developer world, which is why I wanted to marry that to build on what Phil was saying, the belief should be that a developer can build something that was in his or her dreams, something that they always wanted to make, and now it is possible. If you get that embedded, you can have any tool you want.
Right. So the belief is in the access as well. The belief is in the ease of constructing something. That's
important. But what's essential and what's truly innovative is like the developers that find us and stick in our ecosystem when we're still at that stage, that they have wanted to build decentralized solutions. They've tried Ethereum or they've tried something else, but what has stuck in their mind is a belief that they want to make something that's different from what they can currently make. And so when they find us, they don't go anywhere.
Right. So here's the big question though, Dave, and it's a really relevant one. How do you break that vicious and insidious sort of narrative out there that 10x is, a commonplace? When you put a blockchain bet down, you're going to make, a fortune back. That unfortunately is a real narrative, and it's very antithetical to the kind of thing that you're trying to build. But it does exist.
Holochain has no currency, so just even to start with, that you're already taking that out of the equation, because you're saying, here's a framework for building distributed applications. Let's improve the framework, or let's build applications. Look at what we can do here.
Right. But
now I'm thinking like this, but nowhere in that picture is there a currency. And if you think about the way we do communities building, the way we run hackathons, the way we run meetups, the way we bridge the online offline communities, the way we're building infrastructure to empower developers, how we structure our organization, the token of, the Holo token that is the pre-purchase to credit on the Holofuel network isn't integral to all of those things I've just described.
Right. But my question is more about how do we shift the narrative so that what underpins and drives Holochain becomes that which is supported by the majority in this emerging environment that we call the crypto sphere, to start with, for example. Because many people come in with personal intentions to make money. And, many are throwing around numbers like 90 to 95% are actually there really just to change their own financial outcome.
I think if we can get a really clear distinction between Holochain and Holo, you think about it like this. Let's say we go to Airbnb, which is hosted on the Holo network, right? And you can just use your browser, you type in airbnb.holo, and there you are. You're looking for somewhere to stay for the weekend, and you make a booking. All of that was done through the Holo network. And the hosts that are hosting that website, they're getting paid for the hosting, all that kind of thing. And that thing's all going on. But you personally don't care. It was just a website.
Right.
However, you now buy a property and you want to put your property onto the Airbnb network. Now you install Holochain locally. And we've got an Electron app for doing that. So it's super simple. You just download it and run it and off you go. Now you are now part of the network. So you have joined the network and you are providing hosting power to the rest of the Airbnb network because you're running it on your local machine. And there can be monetary incentives in that as well, but the incentive for you was that it works better and you are now part of the network. And if you think about things like lots and lots of you see lots of really cool ideas come online where people can join a free community and they build these free communities and it's all going great and everybody loves it. And then the person who built it realizes that they can't afford to pay the hosting for everybody each month, and now you pay a subscription fee. And then all of these community groups go, right, where's the next one? And off they go. Right?
That's true.
And we'll go and find something else free.
Yes.
With this, you can say, well, the community hosts it. So there's no essential cost because I'm using the spare computing power and the spare internet access on my own setup to provide a small amount of the hosting.
And it's clear with Holo that, once again, the Holo itself in isolation is that hosting platform. And then what drives that again is incentivization structures that have been put in place to make sure people can continue to support and use the system. But fundamentally, the hosting opportunity is there for those that want to capitalize on being a host in the ecosystem. But going back to what Dave was saying, though, I want to talk about more the fundamental, dare I say, asset. Because, gentlemen, if it's not a currency, can you just articulate for the audience just once more, because it is so it's so new and so fresh, how you would just explain Holofuel when we're so used to some sort of digital asset terminology or currency, if you will. And you talked about that mutual credit. Just really drive home the distinction there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, so for a distributed hosting company, say, Brad, you have you want to have an application that it's like introduction to blockchain, or and understand blockchain to be able to build a great blockchain business. You've got your application, and you're running it on the Holo network. So you make that application available, and a whole bunch of people want to get access. So you'll have a network of hosts, and you'll have people on their phones or their browsers trying to get access to this application. So you will then be paying hosts who are hosting it all around the world every time they serve up the application to any of your users. In a centralized world, that's easy. You just pay an invoice to AWS.
Right.
In the Holo world, that's also easy for you. You just pay Holo. But for Holo to then provide that network, there needs to be micropayments to any host that serves any information to any user. So you need a massive microtransaction network to be able to support the infinite complexity of that kind of hosting network. Right? And so firstly, you need to design a currency that can support that environment. It can deliver on the promise of microtransactions for hosts between different parties, and to be able to accurately track the hosting that was provided. That's one. Second is, any currency, you've got to think about the currency system and the life cycle of the currency, right? And so Holofuel has, inside the design is thinking, well, what does this look like before the hosting network even exists? What does it look like as the network's sort of getting up and running? What does it look like as it moves to maturity? And what does it look like as it slowly dwindles and is replaced over whatever time frame? There's two core components, but the crux of Holofuel is as follows. Holofuel, because it's purpose-built for hosting, and its pricing and value is driven by the amount of hosting activity that has taken place, and because it can be used not just by Holo, the hosting company, but by other hosting companies, has the possibility to represent the transition from hosting, from a centrally controlled activity, to computing being a mass distributed owned commodity, right? And Holofuel be the currency that represents that commodity.
Right. And I think that's where you clarified it, because often that terminological confusion happens, not just with Holochain, but many, when there's a reticence to talk about Holofuel as a currency. And the way you're explaining this to us now, and also if you go through all the videos, all the documentation, there's a lot of references to stable coin currency systems. So in that respect, do you concede that it is a type of currency? Is Holofuel an internal economic currency for the ecosystem that you're building? And also, does it move beyond Holo? Does this expand into Holochain? Given that you're also supporting the computational power that drives a lot of the infrastructure here, and there has to be some sort of modeling that supports that from a monetary standpoint.
So Holo does move. Holofuel moves beyond Holo, because Holofuel can be used for. Holofuel can have a broader application than hosting, but can also be used by other hosts. Right? In terms of Holofuel being powering Holochain, it's not necessary, because if two nodes are running Holochain, there is no cost to their transaction, because the compute power is provided locally as part of our existing setup. So nobody needs to be extracting value from that transaction. There's no cost to providing the network because it's a network of networks. And there's no cost to the transaction happening because the cost is borne by the nodes. So there's nothing that needs to step back and power Holochain transactions except for Holochain nodes. So that they will always be free, and that layer will be provided by Holochain without requiring a currency.
I think it's absolutely fascinating. And gentlemen, given that we are seeing this anomalous sort of juxtaposition between a volatile so-called asset, that everyone's trying to bank on through that belief we're talking about, and then they're suggesting that by nature some of these are actually currencies that will eventuate to some sort of stability in the future where they can use it as a currency. It's again anomalous because we're not seeing the logic there. Do you think that because the ecosystem is such now in present day that everyone's still betting on prospective value and relying on volatility, is that one of the challenges of Holochain, in that you not only have to really explicate the complexities and essentially break it down into all the different parts and show the robustness of the architecture, but also try and change the narrative of value so that people aren't perhaps betting on short-term shills, short-term gains, because it's clear to me that Holochain's not designed at all for that.
No, it's not. The way that we designed the currency of going from the ERC20 hot token and being transferred into Holo is that we priced it at, I think we advertised it at 1/10,000th of the cost of the same transaction on the Ethereum network, with the idea that, it'll be somewhere between there.
Okay.
Then what happens is, as the Holo hosting network goes live and people actually start hosting real websites, and then the people who are hosting them can start to set their own prices and say, well, I've got cheap power, cheap internet access, and my hosting is cheaper. However, that may be outside of Australia, for example. And if you're hosting, say, like a lawyer's application or something to do with medical records or all that kind of stuff, those things have to be hosted inside the Australian geographical area, right? So then we would pay for hosting inside those areas. So there will be many different prices for hosting, as there are currently now. Premium hosting is more, cheap hosting is cheap. So that the actual value of each individual Holofuel credit will stabilize over time. And we expect that to take 6 to 12 months, which is why we also we have reserve accounts so that we can slowly start to, we can take up some of the shock of that, so that the initial investors who bought at the ICO or buying in now will be rewarded, but not like ridiculous amounts like the other ICOs promise. It'll be, you'll make a decent return.
Well, already though, as well, Dave, if you do an analysis on the price when you first ICO'd to now, as you transition with that one-to-one switch, it's already been, from a monetary standpoint, it's already been profitable for them. Many would argue, and many of them already exited in their positions, probably, given we can see transparently how the market movement's been. But I'm just really talking about now and the future as well, not just those initially invested in the potential of this ecosystem, because so many are banking on, dare I say, questionable token models that are almost nuanced to be securities, if you get what I mean, or some sort of non-equity, but an investment in an ecosystem that is suggesting that if there's going to be, increasing value in that asset, they literally call them digital assets for that reason. So given that you're a completely different model, do you think one of the big challenges is just simply, removing that idea of increasing value in an asset, for the most part, when most of these startups simply don't have that ability to even state that?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think I get where you're going with this. And I'd say the two things is that unless you know how to rig the game, you're always better playing your own game.
Good answer.
And that's where our strength is. We're seeing a different world. We're seeing the world in a different way. We know there's a problem out there to solve. We know where, it doesn't matter which angle you look at or which lens you look at, we know that computing has a bunch of problems to be solved. And we're just going full speed ahead to solve those problems. And I think like our belief strongly is building belief in the blockchain world is unnecessary because it doesn't, and is because that is not the thing that gets us to adoption. So if you look at like a lot of the projects, you know, they'll build a partnership here, they'll build a partnership there, they do this, they do that, and you're packaged up like a nice pig for an IEO or a nice ICO or whatever. It's all great, but it doesn't get you 1 million users on one of your applications.
Exactly.
You know? And so for us, it's just completely push forward as fast as we can on technology that solves problems in such a way that adoption is inevitable. And so it's like, remove this barrier, remove this obstacle, make sure we've got a hosting network set up, make sure no one would ever know that it's even powered on a chain at all, whatever. Just do new things that people need. That solve
it makes a lot of sense. So Dave, in that respect, you know, in an ideal scenario, you wouldn't have, you know, a lot of exchanges enfranchising trade, because the trade is that day-to-day sort of, you know, play around with price. Now,
yeah, this stuff just doesn't. I really get it, and I think like for me, it doesn't. I don't worry so much about it because I think like whether it's exchanges, whether it's ICOs, or whatever, they're all based on our deep-rooted psychological behavior, right? And we, you know, no matter how many times we've heard otherwise, we're so often as people going to take short-term gain at the expense of the long-term. So to me, the industry just represents the deep-rooted psychosis of ourselves and our species. So like for me, how I look at it is like, oh, okay, well, where am I also motivated by greed? Where are my intentions or my actions misaligned? And so it's just an external view of what's going on inside us all to some extent. So worrying about it isn't the thing. The best thing is to build something that makes systems and structures that renders a bunch of that unnecessary or obsolete. You know, if we can do that. And so yeah, so being caught up in the whole world. But I will say one thing about the world, which is the shift to IEOs, to me, is and the fundraising structures of 2019 is the most remarkable shift, because you take out the most important part, and we had it in ours, which was an initial community offering. Yes, they were called coin offerings or initial, you know, ICOs, but ICO still had to rely on some form of community, and that's the thing I think has warped so much by 2019 is that none of these projects can succeed without community.
Exactly.
Right? And the idea of building decentralized technology and not having a community is totally antithetical to what you're trying to build.
Exactly. And there's too many of them.
Today is that you don't need communities to fundraise. It's crazy.
Yes, it's almost the narrative has become the power in itself and the orchestration and collusion. But you raise a really important point about community, but I still want to talk about speculation, because you pride yourselves, gentlemen, on having a very structured approach. You know, you're back mapping from the future in and really thinking about it. You've given a lot of forethought to this and how you can build a truly agent-centric system. But in doing so, because of the nature of crypto itself, and speculation is rife, can that thwart the stability? Given that speculation implies volatility in marketplaces now, if you had an influx in people being able to access that currency, could that actually threaten its stability in itself?
No, we see that the only real once Holo is up and running and the prices had 6 to 12 months to stabilize, there won't be any reason to buy Holofuel unless you're going to buy some hosting or pay for a developer or something. There's no investment in the currency itself, because the currency will be super stable. So you're not going to.
I love that answer. So can you Phil? Can you talk to us a bit more about the numbers? I think it's something like 133 billion in total supply. That's part of the reason. Oh, my apologies. So let's talk about that, gentlemen, because without that kind of huge number, Phil, you really couldn't say what you just said, because they're definitely correlated. So can you talk us through the modeling, why you set up such high numbers to literally say, those who are thinking investment are deluded, because it's just not going to be that way?
Yeah, well, so once the network is up and running and the hosts have had time to figure out, well, how can I be competitive but also still make a profit? And so that they set the pricing for their hosting, and that will happen. And because the number of hosts is quite large, so that it's quite shock absorbed, so nobody gets to drive the price. And you can't even buy heaps of them and do it. Like you need to, So it ends up being that the only reason to have Holofuel is to pay for the hosting of your website.
Right. It's very utilitarian by design. I really, really understand from what you said. And it harks back to a really important conversation when it comes to corporate coins. Because if we look at the triad, government, enterprise, and you guys, as part of the people represent. Now, if we look at the ideas of Libra, they want to be that corporate coin. They want it to be backed by enterprise and
they're obviously not Australian, are they?
They're obviously not, but mate, the interesting part was that they wanted to establish a currency. Now, you also, inherent in building this ecosystem out for the people, by the people, with tech that is innovative, you still want to have some sort of unit, that represents the eco. They are doing the same. So, what are your thoughts on when you see other parties come into play? Governments are now starting to really act. Are you at all concerned that they could literally overpower something that is agent-centric?
It's so different. I mean, they're all trying to play the payments game, aren't they? And they're competing for the payment space. Because whereas
at the moment, yes.
At the moment, I think to combine the two responses, thing is, when we say Holofuel is just for compute, well, I mean, compute is the fastest growing commodity in the world, and probably at the moment the most profitable industry, right? Or at least so the industry that we're looking at reshaping and is the industry where rent is being claimed at sort of a disproportionate rate right now. I don't know that any government or any other body is really looking at compute in this way and looking to commoditize it in this way. Maybe they will at some time, but I think we have the chance, a bit like Bitcoin did, 12 years ago, to have a huge first mover advantage in the way this fuel unit represents the power of computing. And just say the supply design to go from the 177 billion, well, that was algorithmically created based on the initial community offering demand combined with the crowdfund Kickstarter campaign for the Holo ports. So the more Holo ports that were purchased, the more supply in the community offering that was available. Ended up with 177 billion. And sort of the signal value of that was that at some stage when you're moving towards stability, Holofuel price would be $1 per Holofuel. And we started thought about, well, 177 billion fuel out in the network is a small representation of the total value of hosting that's out there. Yeah?
Right. So again, preempting that utility and that use case and right. That makes sense. Okay. Now, with regard to the overall system, I just want to touch on this with you, Phil, for a moment. We haven't got a lot of time because I know I've been talking about so many different parts. But to clarify,
more developers a long time now.
Right. But to clarify, we've talked a lot about Holofuel, Holochain, and Holo, but there's so many other parts too. You can go through them, but obviously there's there's other components like Holonaut is a term for the members. Holoport we've touched on briefly, but do you want to just reference more the fact that you are compartmentalized in this, overarching architecture, and that most likely there's going to be more parts added to this as you build in the future?
Components, bridges, and stuff.
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things that we built into Holochain is this ability to what we call bridge. So let's say I'm running a chat application, and I've also got my personal data vault. So my personal data vault is not shared with anybody except my devices and possibly a couple of trusted people that I really trust. So they've got copies of my data. But when the chat application wants to know something about me, so I just put up a video last week, I think it was, on a demo that shows how the peer chat works with our personal data vault.
Okay.
And when you fill out the profile and you put in your handle and avatar, and that data is stored by the chat app because it's going to get used all the time. But my full name is stored by me.
Mm-hmm.
When the chat app, so David's in the chat room and he wants to know my full name, you can click on that and that will actually send a request peer-to-peer directly to my Holochain node, which then does what we call bridging. So that is the chat application. I've allowed it to talk directly to my personal data vault,
mm-hmm.
and it can request that data, and then it goes back to David. So, and because it is like DNA, right? You can connect all these different things together to make your own Frankenstein and build whatever you like. So the idea of like holonauts and that we used to name everything Holo something, right? But then
I noticed that.
but I accidentally called something Holo Soul and then realized that I had a Holo Soul. So we're changing the names of some of the stuff, but
but you get also going. Yeah, I think like Phil's working on Holo RIA or REA, which is a form of like supply chain accounting.
Okay.
So and that becomes a core component of the Holochain network. That there's many other components that are being worked on, whether it's alternate types of investment platforms that were then part of effectively like the modular or the building block nature of Holochain, where you plug different components together. And the way we've described like a post is a post, or a comment is a comment is a comment. It could be input into a chat application. It could be a comment on a website. So the modular design pushes through and allows us to bridge information between different applications. And so, you don't just have Holochain, Holo, Holofuel, and then associated organizations. You also have all of these components that we build and that the ecosystem and community build that other people can pick and choose in building their applications.
Right. And it makes sense because it aligns with verticals in the industry. And Phil, on that note, I wanted to ask you, mate, or either of you, including you, Dave, are you going to integrate or work with enterprise sectors or with SMEs or any other parties? I'm trying to understand, will you have a profit model at any point, whether that be on top of the protocol and the team that you have now? Because when you talk about supply chain, that's a really great example of the benefits of blockchain to, be of service in the new era.
The code that you write, the first thing that happens is Holochain runs a hash algorithm against it. And that hash is the actual address of the network that you can be connected to. So the only nodes that can communicate on that network have to have identical code, like down to the bit, which means that you can build your revenue model into your code. So however that SME wants to operate, maybe it's like they do like story publishing. So you're a story writer, right?
Right.
And then you can build into the code. Every time someone reads it, it's 20 Holo. Or every time somebody downloads it or does a derivative work of it, or all these kinds of different things. So I think one of the other differentiators of Holochain is that we didn't build into Holochain how you need to run your business. Yeah. Or how you need to resolve conflicts, or how you need to check that somebody is doing a particular thing. That is up to you. Build that into the code of your app, and that's up to the developers. And
it's almost very DAO-like in that sense, is that you really allow for that autonomy to flourish with the choices they have from the code. But I want to go back to you for a moment in terms of your own apps. Now, you can literally, as a team, build apps on the ecosystem of Holochain, and in that sense, create some revenue, arguably, or some means of sustaining your own continuation into the future. So, have you got any modelling in that respect of how you generate revenue in the future?
Yeah, it's an interesting. Yeah, so I think that we definitely haven't touched on it today, probably for another time. But to try and build technology like this from an agent-centric perspective, you also have to work in a very different way. And I think I've referenced in a couple of interviews before, like I spent a bit of time in Alice Springs, 4 or 5 years in Alice Springs in Australia.
Nice.
And one of the things I learned in Alice Springs is and sorry for people around the world, but there's a town in the middle of Australia that is, you can drive 1,500 kilometers in any direction and not get to a city bigger than 30,000 people. So it's pretty isolated, right in the middle in the desert in Australia. And what you notice there is there are rules set by people 1,500 kilometers to the north, or people set in the capital of Australia or other places. And they make a lot of sense when you're in a nice office looking out over a parking lot with a bunch of commuters sitting next to you. They make a lot less sense when you've got 4 people in a community in the desert, right? And they sound absolutely fantastic. It sounds great to say, let's provide housing for Aboriginal communities. But when the house is being driven 1,100 kilometers and something breaks down and no one knows how to fix it and it has to get shipped back 1,100 kilometers, you start to think about, oh, I wonder if centralized planning and control doesn't always work.
Right.
Yeah. It's an extreme example of saying, like, we have to build our organization and we have to build the way we work according to the same principles of the software that we're building. In terms of, like, so Holochain, like, so think of us as the Linux of the DLT world, right?
Okay.
That's a really good way of seeing what we're trying to build. There may be a red hat on top of Holochain.
That's what I was going to ask you. I was going to ask, are you going to be part of a red hat conversation?
It may be the two of us, or it may be all, I think, like, what we're encouraging our teams to do, and the people that we attract, is people that are passionate about building this kind of stuff. And so they're looking for a way to create value in the ecosystem. At the moment, it's standing up Holochain and standing up Holo. As Holo becomes a thriving entity, then it's going to attract more people who are really passionate about hosting. And they'll be running the organization, they'll be growing it, and then maybe Phil, or maybe we might be doing the red hat.
Right. So in that sense, though, Dave, is the plan to graduate more towards, a more self-regulated or autonomous systemization, so that, the operations are, moving away in that distribution, but also authentically, you can literally observe, decades later, that it's just operating as it's designed to do.
Yeah, for Holochain, definitely. Well, Holochain comes to a form of stability and it becomes a community-owned, controlled, open source project. And we're not a huge, not a huge way away from that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of, like, Holochain governance works, like again, the natural living systems, you have to start with some centralized control.
Right.
And then that is gradually reduced and reduced and reduced. And so that's kind of the structures, again, that we've been used to building. You can't have the focus of having to build Holochain, Holofuel, all these things, and the prioritization, the decisions need to be made to get there. You need a form of centralization, but over time that becomes distributed across the community for Holochain, etc. And the idea is to be looking at the world and the way it's shifted in 40 years' time,
right?
And both be really proud of what we've built, but also be super active in building components of the ecosystem, because that's what we're all passionate about.
Right, and what I like is also you start with the ideal and then you work on how you make it real, and that's exactly what you're doing now. In terms of the verticals, we touched on one from you, Phil, and that was supply chain. What are the other verticals? In the readings I've done, things like medical come up, ID, mesh networks. Surely the possibilities are endless when it comes to working with current verticals that exist for the potential of this, and for developers to really optimize the code and integrate the current systems so that you can start to better the outcomes for the mainstream.
Yeah, exactly. Like, pretty much everything that exists can be rewritten in Holochain. That's a
cool.
given. Yeah. So we have a thing called the Commons engine as well, and they're going to be coordinating a lot of that common functionality that can be used across different things. Like you mentioned, medical records. Like, that's an obvious agent-centric kind of application that's going to get built pretty soon.
Mm-hmm.
Things like supply chain, they're very agent-centric as well. And like we're looking at doing things in the airline industry and all sorts of stuff. So,
so talk us through this, guys. How do you sit? I'm so fascinated in hearing not only are you so transparent about it, but you don't seem to be the two speakers in the space who are advocating for significant PR every time there's an announcement. You just don't come across like that, and that's rare. But also, you are going to be making some significant partnerships. You're going to be doing some really innovative things with different verticals, as you're alluding to, Phil. So how does it sit with you when you are doing PR? when you are making announcements, when you've done something real, when you know there's going to be a reaction to that, and people are going to FOMO, as you call it, they're going to react in the space and get all excited every time there's an announcement. Are you cautious in this sense because you're really building things and doing real things, but you know there's also the emotional response?
Yeah, very much so. Like we don't go around announcing partnerships and things like that. That's just something that we're doing in the background so that we can build things. What we do announce is, hey, look, this works. Check out this. Like the demos that I've been putting up is like, this actually works. And this is how you build it. You know, we have developer camps so people come on and learn how to code for Holochain, that sort of thing. And it's not, you know, we don't say we've got a big partnership with, you know, Mozilla or whatever, something like that. We just build stuff and then let people figure it out, because it's not about, we're trying not to do the FOMO thing.
I really respect that. I mean, that's very rare.
Yeah, as I said, we've got, like, you know, there are people who are better at that game than us. So let's just stay, you know, I'm a big believer in you build teams around what you're uniquely capable of. You then enhance your limitations and you minimize your weaknesses, right? And for us, our unique strength is the way we see the world and the technology and social systems that we're using to be able to get to what we think, you know, is a better outcome for global coordination at scale. And yeah, it's not our strength. There are people who are really good at it. They're in any industry. There are people who are great, and these people are great at fake it until they make it as well. I'm sure it works, and I'm sure it works for a lot of businesses. It's certainly how the services the industry works. But for us, it's kind of the opposite. We think that to really sustainably create this shift and see mass adoption, that not only do we need to be able to build a protocol or framework for distributed apps, but then we need to be able to build great examples on top of it. We need to show stuff working, and we need to then make it so easy and have the incentives so well aligned that you're drawing people into the structures of a different and better world.
And possibly too, right, and Dave, possibly in that sense, this is where you really put yourselves forward in that first mover position, because while so many are actually adopting the idea of fake it and until we make it, or fake it until we break it, or fake it until we possibly make it. You know, whatever those narratives are being put forward, and all these, you know, questionable PR approaches with, you know, questionable partnerships that are all of convenience for the short term. What is clear with you is that you're playing a very different, not even game. You know, you're literally assuming a different mindset as a team, where it's all about proof first and proof second and proof third. And it sounds like a lot of the rest of this stuff that happens in crypto is just noise to you all.
What?
It sounds right. Okay, point taken. So I just want to talk to you really quickly about, you know, the roadmap now, because once it was hot, you know, in terms of the token, now it's moved to Holofuel as the core conversation. Stable currency is part of the narrative as well. What can we expect, gentlemen, in the roadmap in terms of whether it be core technology, core milestones that are planned, or even the transition into more seamless adoption of Holofuel for developing?
It's a good question. It's been a big part of tension in our community over the last 6 months, because we went from roadmap with dates and times into we don't have dates, but we have a clear deliverable, which is that we want to move to open alpha, which is 5,000 holoports are out in the world being run and tested. That has a series of requirements. The most pressing is that networking supports the ability to be able to run 5,000 holoports out in any network configuration out in the world. Okay. So that's what we're going for, because we're tackling problems that no other blockchain project has needed to solve, and really no other tech project has had to look at in the same way as us. We don't know. There are a few unknown unknowns, a lot less than like 12 months ago, but still a few, which means that setting dates just sets up terrible expectations. So what we do is instead say, this is what we're to get to. So here's our target, open alpha. These are the 5 things that we have to do to get there. We've got videos about it. We've got writing about it. And then we publish our weekly developer progress as well as show all of our developer activity. And so the convergence of that eventually gets us to the point of when Holoports shift. We're getting closer and closer every week, but we'll know we have a date with when it's, you know, in our sprints, we can say this is exactly going to happen in 2.5 weeks' time.
So essentially they're estimates, you know, they're ballpark, you know, in the roadmap, but what's important is you're showing the rungs, you know, as we step on each rung, you know, there's more evidence of development towards that benchmark. And that's really, again, quite rare. And it sounds like also you're reticent to give a finite time because it puts too much pressure on everyone, whether it be the speculator, whether it be the one who's supporting as a developer, whether it be you guys as the team. Perhaps there's no need for a specific time, but more importantly, just to show you are developing, you're building.
Yeah, and I'll let Philly wants to jump, but I'd say that the one thing that comes up from the community as a good argument is this idea, and, you know, again, in psychological research, it's one you aim for the stars, you set an impossible deadline, and whatever, you reach the moon, or whatever the phrase is. I'd say that for us, that what we have is a group of people that are incredibly passionate about having Holochain applications working in the world. We don't need, having a date or not makes no difference to us. What we want is the stuff that we're building running, right? And what we need to acknowledge is the complexity of what we're building, and the build process is huge. So the date does create a pressure, because it's a reinforcement, because having something that's slightly unachievable, like we will do this tomorrow, and unachievable in that you can't, say a year ago, you couldn't have looked at where we needed to get to and rationally and logically written out all the steps, because it had never been done before. This is true R&D innovation. Having, when you've already got people who are self-motivated and desperate for the thing to exist, that is just an unnecessary tension, in that you're already working as hard as you possibly can to get there. So for us, the dates just became, unnecessary in a whole bunch of ways. And what we really want to get to is clear prioritization, good ways of working, effectively run developer teams, so that we're churning out improvements, we're solving our unknown unknowns, and we're getting to alpha as soon as we can.
Got it. And that makes a lot of sense when the predominant phrase is when moon for the majority, you know, of participants in Telegrams, for example, or in, you know, the majority of startups, because there's a real impatience when it comes to growth in price of many projects, as you both would know. Now, are there any other things that you want to mention in terms of, you know, the planning? You mentioned you're not going to give specific dates, but there must be things that you want to mention that you're excited about in terms of what you're doing behind the scenes now.
Yeah, well, the green dot on the Holoport that I showed before, that indicates that our automatic update of the Holoport OS system is now working. So that's another major step happened. So
that's great.
I mean, there's just, it's. I think the best way for your audience to connect to that is just every week we publish our developer activity, but we also do a reflection through our dev pulse. We talk about what we've achieved and what we haven't achieved over the course of the week. We have AMAs with Phil on our new Holochain forum. We built a forum as a bit more of a discussion and reflective space for building community rather than Telegram. But yeah, I think if we think about the groundbreaking nature of Holochain and of Holo and of Holofuel and of the applications that are building on it already, there's every week there's something that you think, wow, this multiplied by 10, or this happening here, or this being connected to this can really reshape this industry. You know, aviation can change, disaster relief can change, IoT can change, transportation can change. So it's, I think that it's not so much what are the 2 or 3 things moving towards mainnet are we excited about. It's more that every week we're just working on stuff.
Yeah, and much respect to you both. You know, you're making this very clear. So essentially, it's when you've done something, you'll let us know, and that's unconditional. You know, again, you're pretty hard line on it, and it's rare. And we need more people, quite simply, taking that approach, I think. Now, gentlemen, you raised just over 20 mil, I think, when you did the ICO. How are you going with funds? You know, you've got to pay people in the system, you know, in your team. You've got to be sustainable. Do you have a runway of funds from your ICO to keep going?
Yeah, so we're working on it. We've got a 5-year plan in place, and yeah, we just work.
Okay, so we don't have to worry that all the team are going to suddenly run out the door because they're not getting paid.
No.
Okay, that's important. Now, with regard to, I guess, you know, discussing the centralized aspects, is there anything you'd like to mention in terms of, you know, the predominant dichotomization in that narrative of and valorization of decentralized versus centralized, especially when you're about distribution? Are we missing the mark, gentlemen, entirely when we do try and make that that comparison and contrast of the two terms?
Yeah, we don't really care so much about the centralization versus distribution thing. It's more about the agent centricity of it, like giving back accountability to people and people owning their own data and being accountable for what they do.
Mm.
So whether or not that's a centralized system or decentralized, it's not really, that's not what we're aiming for. We're aiming for people to become more aware and accountable of their own data on the internet.
Their own actions, yeah.
Right, and all the technology is designed to do that as well. You're literally enabling data to be that point of value. The technology allows us as users to create our own networks. It allows us to use the tech to build our own infrastructure. So it's exciting to think what the future is coming forth for Holochain. Gentlemen, this has been a really long interview, and I sincerely thank you for your time today to let us have a more complete understanding of what you're trying to build and what you're doing now. Is there anything you'd like to say, both of you, to finish off, to just reinforce what you stand for at Holochain?
Yeah, I would like to just finish by saying, when people talk about, and when the world talks about a concept, decentralized or centralized being the most important thing, already you've moved away from building anything that could possibly be adopted, because centralized technology can lead to decentralized technology can lead to centralized societies or centralized power or centralized control. And so I think like what matters to us is that we can build a world where people matter, and people knowing they matter because they can control what is theirs to be able to control. They can operate what is theirs to operate. They can use what is theirs to use, and they're empowered to build these networks so they can collaborate, communicate, work at global scale with a local feel. That's it.
Well said. What about you? Excuse me. What about you, Phil? What would you like to say to those people from the dev side of things, at least, and the tech side, to reinforce, you know, the value of Holochain?
I would say that I really like the biomimicry approach that we've taken, in that if you think about your body with all the cells in your body, right? Can you point to the master cell? You don't have one, right? What happens is that the cells come out of stem cells, and depending on the signals and the food and the energy and what they get from around them, they do a particular thing, which is how Holochain applications will work. You know, like David was talking before about, you know, Outback Australia, things out there are completely different into the city. So a Holochain app that was born in that area will act and operate differently to one that is used in the city. And that's what we're trying to bring to people.
Well, guys, obviously that analogy, you know, is really pertinent right now, because we're seeing duplication, the cloning of what already is, be the real value, and that is that acknowledging the sameness when it comes to the potential of this tech. Really, it behooves us to translate that in the social sense, in our own agent-centric approach. What we do with the code is what matters, but fundamentally that analogy of cells comes down to the sameness, and how we appropriate that is what matters. So, gentlemen, you're changing narratives. You're literally trying to use tech to enfranchise and empower us as people in a way that hasn't been done before. It is, some would say, idealistic. You're saying no. You're saying it's realistic because it can be done now. And it's exciting to see in this crypto domain quite sincerely that we're talking about something so revolutionary in this context. Social reform, born out of tech that can actually enfranchise more than just, you know, a financial position, but more importantly, a social one. So thank you, gentlemen, for being part of this. And it's great you're Aussies. It's great that you're leading a conversation like this. I sincerely wish you all the best. I hope in the future we can have shorter conversations that are really focused on different aspects of Holochain.
Fantastic.
Yeah, been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Thanks, guys.